Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger, and I'm going to start the show with some fantastic personal news. Now, for those of you who have been listening diligently to the podcast, you know that every few episodes or so, I've been mentioning, I've been going down from 5 days a week doing new shows, new podcasts, down to 2 shows a week, 3 shows a week, new content 2 or 3 days a week. So why the decrease? Part of it has been, yes, the current global situation has added up to my time being, I've been more busy. So we're doing all the video production and stuff for our church services. I'm editing all those videos. In addition to, I'm still coming into work. Nothing has changed throughout this entire pandemic in regards to me coming into the radio station for my day job, for my 9 to 5, so to speak, Monday through Friday. Things have been getting a little busier. One of those things, and I'm so happy to tell all of you this, is that my wife and I are expecting our first child. And we could not be happier. I'm sitting here recording the show right now, and I'm just beaming. I'm so happy. I'm going to have my first son or daughter. The new littlest geek is expected in November, around Thanksgiving time. A Thanksgiving baby. There'll be plenty to give thanks for in November. So I'm so ecstatic to share that news with everybody. So hopefully at some point, I think especially when the pandemic lets up a bit and things get back to normal, or a new normal, so to speak, that I will be able to ramp up my production schedule again for the podcast, because I miss doing that every day. I really do miss talking to you 5 days a week, with 5 podcasts a week. There's so much stuff that's been going on and so many things that have been on my mind, and it's just been, I'm trying to manage the workload, so I haven't been recording every single, well, not every single day, but 5 days a week like I had been doing. I can't wait to get back to that schedule. I hope to get back to that schedule soon enough, but for now, I'm doing the 2 to 3 podcasts per week schedule, and one of those podcasts, obviously, is just the podcast version of the radio show that you're listening to right now. The other thing I've been mulling around, well, I'll save that for later. I'll put a pin in that. Actually, no, I'll just tell you right now. So, one of the things I've been thinking about is, if you're a regular podcast listener or regular radio show listener, I've mentioned once or twice that I've been mulling around with what to do with the broadcast versus the podcast, because I feel like it's 2 entirely different audiences in terms of who I'm speaking to with the broadcast and who I'm speaking to in the podcast. Now, in the past, I've mentioned this recently, that with the broadcast, it's broad. It's in the name. It's a broadcast. I don't know who I'm talking to right now. It is very likely that you could be listening right now and you're 75 years old and you are interested in the things, you're a geek about the things a 75-year-old would be interested in. And I can't tell you exactly what that is for you. I don't know you personally. There's another aspect, is that you may be tuning into AM radio because you want to hear more political discussion, or you want to hear something a little bit more feisty. And while I refuse to adhere to, while I refuse to make every single show and every single topic negative, I try to keep this light. On the outset, I said that Geek Therapy Radio was supposed to be an oasis in the political desert, that most shows surrounding Geek Therapy Radio, even on this station, and no matter where you're listening to, are politically leaning. Even the shows that say they aren't political are political. The other day, I heard, not to get too sidetracked, but I heard Glenn Beck on the Adam Carolla podcast, which is amazing. Adam Carolla's podcast is wonderful. But Glenn Beck said, I hate politics. So I just don't try to do much political content because I hate politics. So are you kidding me? Have you listened to your own show, Glenn? What are you talking about? Your show isn't political. All you talk about is politics and politicians. It is a political show. And I don't mean that to be a negative detractor to Glenn, but it's kind of like, here's what happens. I think hosts kind of boil into their own soup. You know, that you throw a stick of butter into the soup and it just melts and it emulses into the soup. It becomes a soup and you can't tell that you were ever butter. So I think that's kind of happens to a lot of show hosts who say, I'm not political. I don't like talking about politics. Have you heard yourself recently? You're so deep into it that you don't realize that, yes, you do. All you do is talk about politics. Now, on Geek Therapy Radio, where I say that I'm an oasis from the desert of politics, that doesn't mean that I won't stray away from politics when it's relevant or when it means something to me. So this is all in the parentheses of what I'm discussing right now, which is I'm trying to figure out what the broadcast is versus what the podcast is. With the podcast, Geek Therapy Radio podcast, I can be way more specific on subjects. Way more specific. I just talked about AMD processors and did they lie to us with socket AM4 support. I was very specific, and I can do that on a podcast. Whereas a broadcast, if I get too specific, the fact is that many of you out there aren't geeks about that specific thing. So I keep the broadcast more broad in scope. And so that got me thinking. This is where it's all leading to. This is what's percolating in my brain. And I want your thoughts on this if you're listening to the podcast version, or obviously if you're listening to the broadcast version. I would like to expand my show, expand the reach of my show, make it more marketable towards sponsors. Remember that I said I'm expecting my first child in November. That has the gears turning to what I can do to turn a profit with Geek Therapy Radio. And one of the things I'm thinking is just it's just percolating political. It's percolating in my brain is possibly renaming the actual radio show. Keeping Geek Therapy Radio as a podcast, keeping the Geek Therapy Radio podcast, or just calling it the Geek Therapy Podcast, but possibly changing the name of the radio show to That's Cool, or That's Cool. Just naming the show That's Cool with Johnny Hamburger. The broadcast, not the podcast, the broadcast. When I'm on the radio, it's just something that's in my mind. We'll pick it up in the next segment because I want to talk to you about this. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I'm still your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger. So in the previous segment, I laid out some big news that my wife and I are expecting our first child in November. And we are extremely excited about that. And that has me thinking, as any father listening right now can relate, that has me thinking about money and future and care for the child and what I need to do to provide that child the best possible childhood. And it has me thinking about my bread and butter. What am I doing around here? What am I doing with the radio show? So I've been hitting the pavement, so to speak, at least virtually, because you can't go into tons of businesses right now during the current global situation. I got to think about how to make the show more marketable. And the reason I'm telling you this, if you're listening to the podcast and you don't know why I'm going into this, and I don't imagine too many of my loyal listeners are wondering why I'm going into this, I'm going into that for the new listeners who are just joined me for whatever reason. I try to be as transparent as possible on Geek Therapy Radio, up to and including that I don't do a whole lot of edits on the show, especially the podcast. When you listen to the podcast, I don't edit out parts that I don't think flow very well. And I can't tell if I'm shooting myself in the foot with that, if that's a good or a bad thing. But if I make myself sound silly or stupid in a podcast or an interview, I don't edit those parts out. I leave it in there. Even if I ask a question and the response is just crickets, I don't I don't cut that out. I try to be as transparent as humanly possible in all that I do with this radio show and podcast. That's why I'm letting you know that in the interest of marketing and trying to feed myself and my family with this, that I'm retooling, at least percolating the idea of changing the name of the actual radio show. Leaving the podcast alone, leaving the podcast as the Geek Therapy Podcast, but possibly renaming the radio show that broadcasts over the antenna on terrestrial radio. And the name that's bouncing around in my head right now is calling it That's Cool with Johnny Hemberger. Instead of calling it Geek Therapy Radio with Johnny Hemberger, the broadcast would be That's Cool with Johnny Hemberger. And I'll tell you why. And I want to know your thoughts too. You can always email me, geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. geektherapy@iheartmedia.com, or go to the website. There's contact button there as well. Directly, it's just geektherapyradio.com. One more time, the website, geektherapyradio.com. I want to know what you think about any of what I'm telling you here. So here's the rationale behind naming the radio show, naming the broadcast is more specific, naming the broadcast That's Cool with Johnny Hemberger. I feel like as much as I love as much of a part of me as the name Geek Therapy Radio has been, when you're talking broadcast and you're reaching a broad and diverse audience, I think people hear the title some people can hear the title Geek Therapy Radio, focus too much on the word geek, and think, oh, well, this is not going to be for me. I'm not a geek. This isn't going to be for me. Even though I explain many times in the broadcast that we're all geeks about something, and geeks are sexy. That no matter what you're into, whether you're into bodybuilding or muscle cars or airplanes or video games or whatever, the fact remains, cooking, cleaning, we're all geeks about something. But there are still, in a broad and diverse audience, still people who might be turned off or not understand what the show is about, at least initially. And when you're talking about a broadcast, and please keep that framework in mind. I'm not talking about a podcast where you can be specific to something. I'm talking about the broadcast, which is tries to reach a broad and diverse audience, catching them wherever in their life they may be, from any walk of life. That the rationale behind changing the name of the broadcast from Geek Therapy Radio to That's Cool with Johnny Hemberger is the title That's Cool still means I can talk about all the same stuff. I can talk about everything I'm used to talking about on Geek Therapy Radio. It is not a change in format at all. It just means it's even bigger blanket title, because I'm going to talk about things that are cool. So if I'm talking about a fighter jet or new space technology or new rocket technology, something like that, that's cool. But it also gives me the freedom on the rare times that I do talk about something, some sort of hot button topic, or a politician does something that I disagree with in terms of the hobbyist community or whatever I'm fired up about. That's cool is a sarcastic response. That's kind of the beauty of it. That's cool with Johnny Hemberger can mean that's actually cool. This new Tony Hawk remaster coming out for PC and Xbox. That's cool. I want to talk about that later, by the way, for real. That's cool. New SpaceX rockets. That's cool. New EVs. That's cool. New PC components. I'm finally doing an AMD Ryzen 9 3900X build. That's cool. Or it can be the FAA wants to put GPS trackers on every aircraft over a half a pound. That's cool. See, it's sarcastic. And it gives me the freedom to kind of talk about things like that, and not stay so focused, not have to remain focused on geek things. Not that I have been. And again, all of this is me being transparent with you. I always want to be transparent with you listening right now. That sometimes on Geek Therapy Radio, especially with the broadcast, you notice that I I branch out and I divert to more feisty subjects. Something might be weighing on me, something might be pissing me off, something might have me in a sarcastic attitude. I don't want to limit myself with the broadcast, and I don't want to alienate anybody just tuning in to the title and here's Geek Therapy Radio and might be thinking, well, I have no interest in comic books or whatever stereotypical geek thing they're thinking of. If I title it That's Cool, that's way more kind of broad. And I get to talk about everything I talk about on Geek Therapy Radio, but some extra leeway to reach a broader audience, if that makes sense. And again, I can't reiterate enough that I'm talking about the broadcast. I'm not talking about Geek Therapy Podcast. I'm talking just about when the antenna cracks open and it's my show and it's radiating across a city of 6 million people. Just the broadcast. Geek Therapy is not going anywhere. I am not destroying that platform. It's always going to be the Geek Therapy Podcast. But the radio show, I might rename it That's Cool with Johnny Hemberger, because it's a broadcast reaching a broad, variable audience, as I've discussed previously. And it's something I may not even do. In the end, after this all percolates, I might decide, nope, I'm just going to stick with everything. The entire brand across all platforms is just going to be called Geek Therapy Radio and call it a day. But like I said, I'm having a child in November. I have to think about making the radio show, because this is the business of radio, is getting sponsors and getting advertising so that I can feed myself and my family. And I think that calling a show That's Cool is more marketable, broadly marketable, than calling it Geek Therapy Radio. That might be too much of a pigeonhole, calling it Geek Therapy Radio, calling the radio show Geek Therapy Radio. It might be too much of a pigeonhole versus That's Cool. That might appeal to more potential businesses, more potential sponsors, and it's just thinking about feeding myself. That doesn't mean my radio show will ever become 6 minutes per segment of live reads for sponsors around the city. No, I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. If I get to that point, it's going to be a multi-hour show, so it's not just the bulk of it being advertisements for businesses around the city. And I can turn down advertisements too. I don't have to take that big of a load. I'm not trying to become a multi-billionaire with this. I'm just trying to feed myself and my family. That's really it. So anyways, we're going to come back with more Geek Therapy Radio. I'll tell you more about my AMD build. I'm finally building a new PC. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I am still your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. Thank you for listening to me keep you abreast of what I'm thinking in terms of changing the name of the broadcast to possibly That's Cool with Johnny Hemberger. I'll probably still say mental curator. Welcome to That's Cool with Johnny Hemberger. I'm your mental curator. That will probably never change. One thing I want to say also right now, if you're listening to the podcast version of this, you're not going to have to change anything. There's not going to be anything new to download. You will always be able to listen to Geek Therapy Radio right here, and That's Cool right here. If I do change the name of the broadcast to That's Cool, I will just label it in the podcasts That's Cool, then a hyphen or something like that, and just whatever the title of the show is, because it's just going to be a podcast of the broadcast. I just like to keep my audience completely informed on everything I'm thinking about with Geek Therapy Radio. Now, there's some things that I would need to keep sacred, obviously. I'm not literally inviting you into my home with transparency. But in terms of what you're listening to and what you're used to, I let you behind the scenes, as I like to say. And right now, behind the scenes is I'm thinking about retooling the name of the broadcast to appeal to more potential sponsors and listeners. so that the radio show doesn't alienate people and that it makes it more marketable. And again, it's not because I want to get rich. I mean, I would, of course, being wealthy would be great, but I am not a greedy person. If I can make sure that my family's future is secure by doing what I love and hopefully sharing, putting some good into the world, at the end of the day, I would like to have to, with the radio show, no matter what it's called, and the podcast, put more good into the world. I don't want to leave it worse. So that means if I were to, let's say I did change the name of the radio show, if I changed the name of the broadcast to That's Cool with Johnny Hamburger, and I went off on some sort of political disagreement, if I thought it pertained to us personally, hobbyists personally, that I will never end anything negative. And you know from listening to me in the past that I'm the first to check myself. That the more riled up I get about anything, that means I'm more susceptible to making judgments based on emotion rather than making judgments based on reason. And it's a bad word in the modern radio landscape and mass media landscape to be reasonable about something. You don't listen to popular syndicated radio shows because they're boring and reasonable. You want to hear them get fired up. You want to hear your bias confirmed. It's called confirmation bias. So anytime that I get all hyped up on something, I'm the first to check myself. Why am I getting so riled up about this? That leaves room for error if I'm reacting to all of this out of emotion. Anyways, no matter how I conduct a show, I always try to reel it back in, and leave more good in my wake than bad. I will never leave the listener pissed off about something and just put more anger out into the world. Never. I will never leave a show hanging like that. Podcast or broadcast, I'm never going to leave it hanging like that on a negative note. So you go out, you the listener go out, and you're just negative. I think so many shows, if you listen to broadcast radio, especially during the day, during the week, it strings you along with negativity. One show gets you all pissed off at this group of politicians, and it leaves you negative. Oh, I'm pissed off about that. Oh, the freaking government. And then you listen to the next show, which does nothing but reconfirm your feelings that were left over from the last show. Yeah, the government's terrible. Everything's horrible. Texas reopening. Oh my gosh. And it's just stringing you along with this negativity because it feels good to be angry. Anger absolutely releases endorphins. It's a high. It's a rush. And to me, it's cheap. And I don't want this show ever, no matter what it's called, to be cheap. To appeal to you emotionally and cheaply. If I appeal to you emotionally, I will check myself like I always do. If I appeal to you emotionally, hopefully overall, it's more positive. I despise the sentiment that a lot of people have that they hate humanity, that humans are just a virus on this earth. And this phrase, faith in humanity restored, or +1, whatever, I despise that sentiment because I don't think people are inherently bad. And by that I mean this. I don't mean some spiritual argument here. What I mean is, all you see in the news, the only thing that graces your Facebook pages or graces your Twitter feeds or graces your mass media feeds is negativity. You are only evil makes the news. There are 10 stories about evil and about how people are being terrible for every one story of people doing good. That doesn't mean that there is less good in the world. That means that evil is more rare in the world, and that's what gets the attention. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. And when you're talking about news programs and commentary programs, don't get me started on the difference between news and commentary. When you're talking about mass media productions, it's not marketable. It's not going to keep you strung along to the advertisements, to the Tide soap commercials, if every time you turn on CNN, it's just straight up who, what, when, and where, or just good news, or whatever, that doesn't elicit the response to get you hanging on for the next thing. Negativity and only airing negative stories and only being negative and getting you angry by exposing you to all the evil in the world is a way, it strings you along, whether you realize it or not. It confirms your biases. It creates your biases. That's for darn sure. And it's a very cheap way to string you along for that particular segment so that you stick around long enough to see the Viagra commercials and the Cialis commercials and the golf club commercials and the whatever commercials. Fox News, if I may be so blunt, their business model it's almost something to be awestruck by. They know exactly what they're doing. And not just Fox News. Any news agency does this. Any popular one, anyways. You have a string of beautiful women telling you the most horrible stories or stories to confirm your biases. Beautiful women, blonde women, brunette women. It's like a buffet for your eyes. They know their demographic. They know the age of the demographic. They know the sex of the demographic. They know their P1. The P1, their first person that they're talking to. The P1 for KTRH is a 65-year-old white man in the Woodlands. Every time you get on the microphone in KTRH, you need to be thinking like you're talking to a 65-year-old white man in the Woodlands. That's the P1. Fox News Channel knows who their P1 is. That's why it's a string of beautiful women immediately followed by erectile dysfunction commercials. Immediately. It's to get you all worked up, have a hot lady telling you the worst things to get you pissed off, and then commercials to take this pill to make you think that you can still please a woman. If I could be so blunt here in the podcast, or the broadcast. They know. They know. That's the formula. And I refuse to adhere to that formula. My P1 is broad. My P1 ranges from age from probably 12 years old to the day you keel over. From 12 to 118 years old. That's my P1. And that means that the challenge before me to make this thing marketable is all the more challenging. Because I can't focus on the 65-year-old white guy who lives in the Woodlands who's retiring soon or just retired. That's not the sponsors that are likely going to sponsor my show. Real estate people, retirement investments. That's not who I appeal to. That's never going to be what Geek Therapy Radio appeals to, or That's Cool with Johnny Hamburger appeals to. Because I'm not ever going to use this show as a vehicle to leave more negativity in this world. Ever. Even right now, I'm getting fired up. Rest assured that the last segment is going to tie a bow on this to leave good in the world, to leave you feeling good, to leave you feeling better about yourself authentically. Not blowing smoke up your butt, but authentic good in this world. And with that, more Geek Therapy Radio coming up. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I'm getting all fired up here. All the more reason you should go get the Geek Therapy Radio podcast right now in your favorite podcast player. Just type in Geek Therapy Radio and look for the red, white, and black color scheme, and that's it. It's on Apple Podcasts, it's on Google Podcasts, it's on Spreaker, it's on the iHeartRadio app, of course. That's our favorite around here, the iHeartRadio app. I listen to it on Pocket Casts. I listen to most of my podcasts. Actually, take that back. On Android, Pocket Casts is a friggin' amazing app. They're not paying me. This is friggin' pro bono. Maybe they should pay me. But I personally use Pocket Casts on Android. On my iPad, of course, I use the Apple Podcast app. It's like the perfect podcast app, in my opinion. Or maybe it's just the one I prefer. It's the easiest one to use. I listen to the Trailer Park Boys podcast on Apple Podcasts all the time. But Geek Therapy Radio is there, of course. So if you missed the previous segment to see what I was getting all fired up about, make sure you get the Geek Therapy Radio podcast in your favorite podcast player. Look for the red, white, and black color scheme, and you're good to go. Speaking of color schemes, I have finally started to do my new PC build. I have talked to you guys about it for probably a couple years now. Honestly, ever since AMD announced a Ryzen back in 2000, when did Ryzen come out? 16 or 17? I want to say 16 and 17 is when AM4 socket and Ryzen came out. Anyways, I've been waiting and sitting and waiting for the right time to get into a new computer build. My old computer build is around a 4790K, Intel Core i7 4790K, and by all means, it's still a great processor. I'm still happy to be using it, but my workload has increased to where I know that I can take advantage of extra cores, and that's why I have gone AMD. AMD's competition in the marketplace has just been a boon for PC builders. Right now is the best time in the past 10 or 15 years at least to build a new PC, and I finally pulled the trigger. Now, the biggest thing I was waiting for, anytime you're buying computer components, whether it's CPUs or graphics cards or whatever, there's this instant buyer's remorse no matter what you buy and when you buy it, because you know something bigger and better is always just around the corner. That's not going away. That really wasn't a point of contention for me. That wasn't a big consideration for me. What I was waiting for was a new standard for PCI Express. That was my excuse. So the fact that new Ryzen 3000 processors and some Ryzen or AMD boards can take advantage of the new PCI Express 4.0 protocol, that was when I finally decided, okay, now is in earnest. I feel that this is a good jumping off point. I can make sure that I future-proof my system as much as possible. So here's what I wound up doing. In terms of future-proofing, motherboard is everything. And even more specific to motherboard, chipset is everything. It's not even socket. The last Geek Therapy Radio podcast I did was on the debacle that AMD finds themselves in, where they promised support for the AM4 socket through at least 2020, but the Zen 3 processors will not be supported on older motherboards, on older chipsets. So if you want the new 4000 series Zen 3 processor when it releases likely later this year, and you're on the budget B450 chipset on the AMD side of things, you can't take advantage of Zen 3 processors. Your path of upgradability ends at 3000 series processors if you're still on a B450 chipset. The podcast yesterday was that socket is not chipset. AMD promising support for socket AM4 has nothing to do with promising compatibility with chipset. Now, that's a whole can of worms. If you want to hear my thoughts on that, listen to the podcast yesterday. Having built PCs for, over 20 years, I am not surprised that the newest, latest, and greatest processors coming down the pipe aren't compatible with certain chipsets, despite the fact that they are on the same socket. A lot of the anger at AMD right now is coming from the confusion that socket does not mean chipset, that there are processors that will fit in the socket but be incompatible with the chipset. All that to say is I thought now is a good time to jump into AMD. So here's the build I did. The new Zen 3 architecture processors, when they come out later this year, will be compatible with my board. So I went with an X570 chipset board. It's an MSI, MSI MPG Gaming Plus board. It's a sub $200 X570 motherboard, but it's still I haven't used it yet. That's one thing, is X570s because of AMD's current issues. Lots of people are scooping up X570s. They're on back order. Mine is on back order. I should have it by Monday. Amazon is thinking, but I went with X570 because that is the most future-proof right now, at least until B550 comes out in June. That's a little bit of consumer advice. If you are building a new PC right now and you're going to Team Red, going to AMD, wait for B550 or get X570. That's what you need to know if you want to stay on the latest and greatest compatibility path with AMD. Is B450 is not going to be compatible with 4000 series Zen 3 processors when they come out. All these numbers and things are confusing. I know. I'm just saying, if you're building a new PC right now and you want the most future-proofness out of it, in AMD at least, you want B550 or X570. So I personally went with X570. You're waiting with bated breath, all you PC builders and enthusiasts out there. What processor did you choose, Johnny? I decided to go with the AMD Ryzen 9 3900X. It's 12 cores, 24 threads. That ought to do me for a while. That's pretty good as far as horsepower is concerned. The 3950X is 16 core, 32 threads, but it's $300 more expensive than the 3900X. And what I had to ask myself was, $300 extra for 4 more cores and 8 more threads. Is that worth it? I'm 75%. For spending $400, you are within 25%, give or take, performance of the $300 more expensive 3950X. I thought the 3900X was a really good price balance there. So I went 3900X, and that's going to do me fine for years and years and years. Plus, I'm on X570, so I still have an upgrade path. If I ever decide that, I'm good to upgrade 3900X to whatever's coming down the pipe, I know that X570, at least for the next few years, will be compatible with whatever new is on the horizon. So Zen 3 processors, 4000 processors, maybe 5000 processors. And I also ordered 32 gigabytes of 3600 megahertz DDR4 RAM, which brings me to my next point here. I chose PCI Express 4.0 as being my jumping in point, that I waited for that protocol to become standard on AMD motherboards, and that's the point that I would jump in. Because the next point to jump in, and I know a lot of you are probably already thinking this, would be DDR5. Johnny, you should have waited for DDR5. Well, we don't know when DDR5 is going to get here, and I'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But for now, for the next at least year or so, DDR5, there's no official rollout date for DDR5 RAM. And if you're doing that, you can be waiting forever. Tale as old as time, you can be waiting forever for a jumping off point to build a PC. At some point, you're going to have to pull the trigger and just build the dang thing. So I pulled the trigger, and now I'm building my PC around a 3900X on an X570 motherboard, and I'm starting out with two 16 gigabyte sticks of 3600 megahertz DDR4 RAM, which I fully intend on overclocking to at least, hopefully, 4000 megahertz. But we'll see about all that. That wraps it up for Geek Therapy Radio today. Make sure to visit my friends at Best Automotive in Kingwood on North Park, and know that you are worthy of love. You are worthy of giving love. You are worthy of receiving love. And by embracing your inner geek thing, you will see that you are worthy of your own self-worth and your own self-confidence. Thank you so much for listening to Geek Therapy Radio. I'll see you next time.